Ann Southworth will take us back to conservatives. She is a professor at Case Western Reserve Law School and right now Covington and Burling distinguished visitor at Harvard Law School. Last year, sorry. Anyway,
Actually.
sorry, outdated website. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have her here.
Well, I think my paper rather nicely follows the last one. American Jews, of course, have long defied the general rule that socioeconomic status is the best predictor of Republican Party support, although they have higher incomes, better education, higher job status than most Americans. They are the most liberal white ethnic group in the U.S. and the second most reliable Democratic voting bloc. It's not surprising, therefore, that the best-known Jewish cause lawyers have been associated with causes of the left, of the American political left. And my remarks focus on a much less well-known, probably rare phenomenon of Jewish lawyers who serve causes of the American political right. I'll draw on a book I'm now writing about lawyers of the conservative movement and about class and cultural conflict among them. The book describes striking divisions among lawyers for the primary constituencies of the conservative coalition, that is, social conservatives, libertarians, and business advocates. These lawyers work for different clients in different practice settings, and they're divided by social characteristics, values, and geographic location. And that's what I spent most of my book trying to establish. The book also considers factors that may help forge common ground among these constituencies and among the lawyers for these constituencies in particular. And it focuses particular attention on what I call mediator organizations. That is, groups that seek to appeal to all of the diverse constituencies of the American conservative movement and to promote communication and cooperation among them. So such mediator groups include groups like the American Conservative Union, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hudson Institute, and most important for my purposes, the Federalist Society. All of these groups quite explicitly attempt to appeal to all of the constituencies that comprise the conservative alliance in American politics. The book grows out of research that I'm pursuing with Jack Hines of the American Bar Foundation and Northwestern University and Anthony Peck of the University of Iowa. To define the set of lawyers to study, we began with 17 issue events, that is 17 legislative controversies that were important to different constituencies of the Conservative Alliance in the late 90s. And we looked in online archives in selected newspapers and major magazines to find organizations that weighed in on those controversies. Then in order to compensate for the possibility that this method might be biased in favor of groups that focused on legislative and highly publicized work, we also consulted with 2 published lists of conservative organizations to identify 5 additional organizations that were particularly active in the litigation and research arenas. And those methods identified 86 organizations. I requested interviews with 98 lawyers, prominent lawyers for these organizations, and I interviewed 72 of them. So the interviewed lawyers include many prominent leaders of the conservative movement, including prominent representatives of all the major constituencies. And Table 1 shows the characteristics of the interviewed lawyers. It shows that they're overwhelmingly male. They worked for a large variety of organizations, and they did so in a variety of roles. As officers, litigators, scholars, and consultants. The largest number were located in Washington, D.C., but they were also practicing in Virginia, New York, California, Arizona, and in various locations in the Midwest. Their practice settings included advocacy groups and public interest law organizations, think tanks, universities, trade associations, large law firms, and small firms, and solo practices. 16 of the 72 lawyers, and here we get to what may interest you here. 16 of the 72 interviewed lawyers were Jews. Now, my interviews didn't anticipate the invitation to speak here, and so they did not specifically focus on the relationship between these lawyers' religious beliefs and their political projects. Moreover, the sample is just too small to allow me to undertake any kind of rigorous statistical analyses, so I'm not in a position to offer any grand insights about Jewish lawyers of the political right. But Suzanne and Mark, nevertheless, invited me to say what I can based on these limited data about this general topic. So without identifying the lawyers I interviewed, or the Jewish lawyers I interviewed, because I promised them confidentiality, I'll describe their characteristics, their causes they serve, and a bit about what they themselves have to say about how they came to serve these causes. And I'll also speculate briefly about how the patterns I found relate to trends in Jewish voting patterns and political attitudes. And I would love your help with the latter task, if there's any time. Table 2, and I'm hoping, can you see this? Can you see the table? Yes, I know, but I wasn't sure how you all can't, right? Table 2 compares the characteristics of the interviewed lawyers by religious category. And the Jews in my sample were an especially elite group. You can see that 81% of them had attended law schools in the elite or prestige categories, which essentially means top 20 law schools as defined by the US News rankings. 37% of them had clerked for federal judges, a much higher percentage than any other religious group. The Jewish lawyers served primarily organizations that pursued libertarian, anti-affirmative action, business, and mediator agendas. And only one of them had worked for a pro-life organization. None of them worked for what I've called conservative religious organizations, groups that weighed in on issues such as same-sex marriage, or in opposition to, in favor of banning same-sex marriage, expanding opportunities for school prayer, restricting pornography. Their distribution among the constituencies is quite different from that of the lawyers of other religious backgrounds. Compare them, for example, to the Catholic lawyers, of whom 62% worked for conservative religious advocacy organizations and pro-life groups. Compare them to the type 2 Protestants. And here, this is a category comprised of Protestant denominations, all Protestant denominations except Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Congregationalists, which have been identified as the more liberal Protestant denominations. Of the type 2 Protestants, 63% worked for conservative religious and pro-life groups. The distribution of the type 1 Protestants is much more like that of the Jewish lawyers, in fact, quite like it. Relatively few of them served religious conservative and pro-life groups. They were much more likely to show up in work for libertarian business and mediator organizations. Jews were also fairly evenly dispersed among the different types of practice settings. Again, much more like the type 1 Protestants than Catholics or type 2 Protestants. The Jews in my sample worked exclusively in major cities, compared to 73% of the overall sample and just 50% of the type 2 Protestants and 62% of the Catholic lawyers. There also appears to be some correspondence, and I offer these observations a little tentatively, but with some confidence, between how observant these lawyers were and the types of causes they pursued and the extent to which they identified with the Republican Party. Of the 12 Jewish lawyers associated with libertarian and business groups, just 3 described themselves as observant or active in a synagogue, and only 3 of them described themselves as strong Republicans. 2 of those 3 lawyers were the same. But all of the 3, and again, these are very small numbers, so I don't mean to make too much of them, but all of the 3 Jews associated with mediator organizations described themselves as observant Jews. One of them had come from an Orthodox background, and all of them claimed to be strong Republicans. Indeed, all of them were highly involved in the conservative movement. These data are consistent with recent statistics on Jewish voting patterns. In the last presidential election, Bush did especially well with Orthodox Jews, who gave him 69% of their votes. But he also performed well among Jews of all denominations who attend synagogue on a weekly basis. He won 40% of their votes. And among Jews who rarely or never attend synagogue, he won just 18% of the vote. So I'm short of time, and I won't try to say much about the views of the Jewish lawyers for libertarian and business interests, even though they're fascinating. Many of them, I will say, express disinterest, if not distaste, for the agenda of the social conservatives.